Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we are thrilled to be your hosts for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Martha Hunt Handler. Martha grew up in Northern Illinois, dreaming about wolves, and has always understood that her role in this lifetime is to tell stories and be a voice for nature. She has been an environmental consultant, a magazine columnist, an actress, and a polar explorer, among other occupations. Soon after she and her family relocated from Los Angeles to South Salem, New York, she began to hear wolves in her backyard. This was the start of her 20-plus year career as an advocate for wolves at the Wolf Conservation Center, where she currently serves as board president. Martha is also an author of a newly published book, Winter of the Wolf, an exploration in grief, suicide, spiritualism, Inuit culture, and is inspired by a true story. Martha, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
So, Martha, let's dive into your book and what inspired you to write it, the true story behind the plot.
When I was about 42, my best friend growing up, she found her 12-year-old son hanging. And we were both brought up incredibly spiritual. Her mother led us in spiritual classes and believing that souls can't die, that they're with us always. We just have to keep the door open, need to listen for them, talk to them. And yet when her son died, it was like all of our beliefs went right out the door. Neither one of us could grasp what he could have done in 12 years that would have been enough growth to make sense of his leaving, and especially the way he left. And I just started journaling, figuring out what to say to my best friend. I mean, I couldn't think of anything to make it better or make her be able to open up more about it, or we were just both kind of lost and drifting apart further because we couldn't figure out what to say. And I was getting more angry because of all the friends saying things to her like, well, if he was so sick and, why didn't you get him some help? And the truth was there was no signs of depression or anything else. It just really came out of the blue. And she deep down never believed it was a suicide, which was hard to understand given that she found him in his room. There was no one that came or left that was in the house. No sign of forced entry. There wasn't any other marks on his body. So it was always sort of this weird thing out there that was hanging in the air of her staunch belief that, well, I know how it looks, but that's not how he went. And so I just started writing, and it wasn't too much longer after I was doing these journal entries, maybe about 6 months or so, that I saw this deer frozen into a lake. And for some reason, it jogged me into realizing that this wasn't just journal entries. This was supposed to be a book. And I actually started channeling her son, who was very much encouraging me to write this story. And it's not necessarily his story, other than the facts of the death are the same, but everything else has pretty much changed.
Wow. And did you have a personal grief journey that added to this in your experiences?
I've had a life grief journey. My mother used to take me to funerals all the time. She was like the Mother Teresa of our town. She knew everybody. She was very social. She was always like cooking meals and bringing them to someone that was sick instead of letting us have them. And so I just grew up around funerals, and I could actually see the deceased souls many of the times at the funeral. And my mother and I would get in the car and she'd be like, well, and I would tell her, yeah, they were, sitting in the upper right hand side of the church, and she'd be like, what were they like? And sometimes they would be like laughing at things that were being said about them, or shaking their head like, no, that story is not true. Or it was just like this funny thing that we had. And I think because she was so encouraging of it, never said like, you're imagining these things or this is nuts. I was never afraid of death. And from an early age, I started reading all those books like near-death experiences and the signs that they can show us that they're still around us, and being open to that. And I think there were times in my life when I shut up because, a lot of people are just not open to hearing those things. But so I would say like, I'm so glad you have this podcast, because this is like my favorite thing to talk about. Like, just if people could all feel that way, it would be so much better. I was going through so much when COVID really hit New York, and so many people were dying, and they weren't allowing priests to give last rites, and how upset the people were. And I thought, wow, like that's just, if I, I'm not religious, but if I were, I would at least want my religion to make me feel like that wasn't necessary. Like my loved one is still going to, end up in heaven, no matter or not a priest was able to give last rites. And so I just think if we could talk more about it, since it's going to happen to all of us, and many times over, are we going to be dealing with grief? If we could see it more as a step to growth, or to coming to it from a place of gratitude that we had that soul in our lives for as long as we did, because that's the gift, right? I mean,
yeah. What's interesting, you mentioned, I've heard people over the years say, well, I think we're death denying in our society. And I've thought about that, and I wonder if it's more that we have a fear of death. Because when I look at even the plots of movies or books, some of the best books and best movies, the plot and a major part of the movie is grief and bereavement and death. And typically heroes are bereaved people, from all of our childhood heroes, Spider-Man and Superman. They're all bereaved. All of their parents died, or the Disney princesses, right? And so sometimes I wonder if it's that there's this fascination with it, because we know that it's going to impact all of us. But deep down, there's just this fear, like almost to even talk about it or have that conversation, which is one of the reasons why we do this podcast.
Right. It's so true. We are at the Wolf Center. We're doing this. We linked up with, I can't remember what they're called, but it's basically they'll do your wills for free. And so I've been talking a lot about it. Like, there's, hardly anyone, and I'm in my 60s now. Like, it's not, we're all getting at that point, and especially during COVID, it's like a good time to sit there and talk about it with your family. Anything, what your wishes are, what your hopes are. I've got everything like laid out to a T, like how I want it to all go, and how, just don't feel bad about putting me in a nursing home if that's like the best thing for everybody. It should be something we should be talking about it a lot more, and so making sure everybody in the family feels comfortable about it.
So I have to share, my favorite color is cobalt blue. So my family's instructed the lining in my coffin, guess what color it's going to be. And anybody that comes to pay respect has to have cobalt blue on somewhere.
Love that idea.
And we're Jewish. I found out through these conversations. My husband, if he should go before me, does not want a Jewish spread. He wants Chinese food.
That's pretty Jewish in its own right.
So you know what? But bringing out these conversations, you know, I hope the legacy behind that is in my death, my children will have laughter. There's mom in the cobalt blue. And when they see cobalt blue, they're going to think, mom and her cobalt blue.
There she is.
Yep.
She's sending me some cobalt blue.
Exactly. Which actually is a great lead-in to your belief in reincarnation.
Yeah. So I don't. It's like they forgot to erase some of those memories in me. Is how the only thing I can think about it, because I have some pretty strong recollections. One of them being burned at the stake for being, like, I would say, an herbalist, you know, and it was like in France. I can see all the people who I've saved and healed, and they're there, like putting logs on the fire, and it's this horrible feeling of, wow, I was doing what the gift that I was given, which was to be a natural healer for people, and I'm being persecuted for it. Yeah, that one is really strong. I definitely feel I was an Inuit, which I bring up in my book. Like my protagonist, I watched Nanook of the North when I was 7 or 8 years old, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember that time really well. Yeah, I've done like past life regression and, you know, heard all these stories. Yeah, I just find it wild. And then it also makes so much sense. Like, I think that belief that we're here to learn, you know, to complete this soul journey, that we put people into our lives because they're going to teach us something. And I just try to remember that more and more. It's been interesting during COVID. I've definitely taken time to use snail mail and write letters to people that I haven't talked to in years, to say, you know, what they meant to me in my life. I was really into nature, and it's mostly because I had a neighbor who would do these wild things in the woods and come up with these strange stories and take me on these journeys through the woods. And yeah, I just wrote a letter to say, I feel like my book wouldn't be here without you, because you opened me to nature, and that was so important for me. And other friends that maybe we're not friends anymore, but you had profound changes in my life that happened because I knew you, and you expanded my mind in some way. Yeah.
That's amazing, remembering and honoring people that have shaped our lives.
Yeah.
And letting them know it.
Right.
That's the real gift there. That's wonderful. So let's go back to the book a little bit. We don't want to give away the ending, but what more can you tell us about it? And let me ask you another question. You're the president of the Wolf Conservation Center. Has that influenced your writing at all?
I don't think it's really influenced my writing at all. Other than, a wolf is a very important character in my novel, but yeah, I mean, maybe it has, just in the I'm always trying to get people to understand how important wolves are. And, I always have people that are like, there's children that are starving. Why wolves? I don't know why wolves, but they've always been in my life. They came into dreams when I was a very little kid, and it was always like this dream would be going on, and there'd be this black wolf over in a corner kind of saying, no, that's not where you should be going. This is what you need to pay attention to. And they were just like, it was just always this one wolf, and he was always trying to show me where I was going off track or what I wasn't doing. So I think they're definitely my totem animals. I was recently in a medical clinic in Austria because I was having horrible stomach issues, and I'd been to so many doctors, and no one could tell me what was wrong with me. And as a part of their clinic, they make you see a shaman, and the shaman put me into a trance, and then he shook me awake a few minutes later and said, do you do something with wolves? And I said, yes, I have a wolf center. And he said, oh my God, there's like 100 wolves in my office right now. He goes, okay, I'm going to put you back in the trance. I didn't know what they were all doing here. So he put me back in the trance. And when I came out, he said, oh, so it's so simple. The wolves are telling you, you need to stay in your wolf lane. Like you're getting too involved in other environmental causes. And that's not what you're supposed to be doing. Focus on them. That's what you're here for. So, yeah.
So how did you come up with the title Winter of the Wolf for your story?
Well,
That is
the title is very, very hard. I have a blog post on it if anyone wants to read further on my website. But it used to be called The Transitory Nature of Souls. And then when I got a publisher, the publisher was like, we really want to market it as a YA book. You know, I'm sure it'll be a crossover. Adults will love it also, but you know, new authors sell better as YA than they will adults. So I was like, okay. So they're like, so Transitory Nature of Souls is not going to sell any YA books. And at that point, I realized, okay, I want to give the profits to the Wolf Center, so it makes sense to have a wolf in it. I added that character. And then we spent probably a good 10 days, like they were submitting what they thought would work, and I was submitting what I thought would work, and we finally came up with that. Yeah, it's a really tough thing because I realized, you know, between the cover art and the title is what makes me choose a lot of books these days. You know, I'm a very visual person, so I'll walk into a bookstore, and if a cover grabs me, I'm like, that's, you know, I have to have this book. And yeah, so reading what it's about comes secondary.
So is there anything about wolves in the actual storyline?
Yes, there is. So yeah, a wolf appears. And is he possibly her deceased brother? Because the protagonist is the younger sister of a boy who is found hung. So that's the question. Can't tell you the answer.
We won't go into the answer. We won't go into the answer. So tell us a bit about your work with the Conservation Center.
So we are located an hour outside of New York City. It was started by Hélène Grimaud, who's a very famous concert pianist. And she's French. And we rented a house that just happened to be adjacent to her property, and I could hear the wolves, which didn't make any sense because we had just moved to New York. I knew there hadn't been wolves in New York in over 100 years, so it was very strange to hear these wolves howling. And I went into the woods one day. I saw the wolves, a couple of them in an enclosure, and there was this trailer. I knocked on the door. I met her. She told me what she was planning to do was to open up this education center and be a breeding and pre-release facility for the 2 most critically endangered wolves in North America. And she asked me if I wanted to join, and I had just stopped work as an environmental consultant when we moved and decided I was going to take some time off to figure out what to do next. And this magically landed in my backyard, and it felt like, okay, a wolf has always been around to help me and guide me, and I get to finally give back. So it's been a really wonderful experience. I think we have right now about 50 wolves. They get moved around a lot for breeding purposes. But it's scary, the numbers and how low they were. So the 2 species we have are the Mexican gray wolves, which there were only 6 in the world. And the red wolves, which there were only 13 in the world. And from that, all those wolves were brought into captivity to start this breeding and release program. And it's pretty dire. I mean, we are using frozen egg and frozen sperm and doing artificial inseminations because we need to get a lot more wolves on the ground the faster that we possibly can. North Carolina is really bad. So in all this time, I think there were 13 in 1989, and there's only 12 today. So that's not been much of a success story. North Carolina has been really tough. But it's been much better in the Mexican. We have I think 130 now from those original 6. So that one's going very well. But it's exciting to be a part of it. It's exciting to be a part of an educational organization. So we just do a lot of education, not only on wolves, but other predators. And now our big thing is explaining to people the difference sort of coyotes and wolves, because I don't know, coyotes are making a huge comeback in New York, as they are many places. I mean, they've actually been in New York City. So just, letting people know that they're not dangerous, they're not going to hurt anybody. It's a really fun journey for me being with the Wolf Center. I love it.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting too, just hearing you talk about, the breeding and then the releasing, the whole way that's even attached just to the idea of death and life and that cycle, and how it's a normal, natural cycle of life, and somehow how we're related,
Yes.
to other life.
Right.
And interestingly enough, how life breeds life, but that somehow death is part of that too. It's what the Khalil Gibran, when he talks about joy and sorrow and how the two interplay with each other. I think death and life do the same thing, right?
So true.
Well, Martha, we're at the end of our time, but a lot of times people who are watching the show want to know how they can connect with our guests. And I wonder if someone wanted to connect with you or your work, how would they go about doing that?
My website, marthahunthandler.com, is the best place. I've got my blogs there. You'll learn a lot more about me, more about the book, see reviews that I've gotten. So I hope you'll contact me, reach out, read it. Let's have a discussion.
Great.
That's great. Martha, we want to thank you so much again for being a guest here on Let's Talk Death, and for sharing your journey and the story behind your book and your great work that you're doing with wolves.
Thank you, and keep up the good work. I love what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks again, and also thank you to those who are joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward.
Make sure to sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links to future episode of Let's Talk Death.
And again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Let's Talk Death.